Let me ask you something difficult, but necessary. What if you went to bed tonight and never woke up? That's exactly what happened to Thomas Miller, a 67-year-old retired teacher in Ohio. No pain, no warning, just a quiet end in his sleep. Some might call it peaceful, but what if I told you it was preventable? Today, we're talking about 4 bedtime habits you must avoid after turning 70. Habits that might seem harmless, but could silently put your heart, brain, and overall health at serious risk. We're not here to scare you. We're here to protect you. Because these are the kind of changes that can mean the difference between waking up to another beautiful morning or not waking up at all. If you're over 60 or love someone who is, this video could be one of the most important you watch this year. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Have you ever worried about your bedtime habits or noticed your sleep changing as you've aged? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe, because staying informed about your health shouldn't stop at the doctor's office. Let's talk about the bedtime mistakes Thomas and many others didn't know they were making. Ready for the first one? Number 1. Eating a heavy meal late at night. Thomas had a routine. At around 8:30 every evening, he'd settle into his recliner, turn on the news, and warm up his late dinner. It was usually something comforting, a big bowl of pasta, maybe some meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Nothing fancy, just good old-fashioned food. He'd finish eating around 9:15, watch a little more TV, then head to bed by 10. On the night he passed, that's exactly what he did. No signs of distress, no complaints, just never woke up. You see, eating a large, heavy meal before bed may seem harmless. But for seniors, especially over the age of 70, it can quietly stress the heart, spike blood sugar, and even disrupt nighttime breathing. When your digestive system is still hard at work while you sleep, your body can't fully rest. For some, especially those with underlying conditions, this can trigger heart arrhythmias or even silent strokes during sleep. According to the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, seniors who eat within 2 hours of bedtime are 40% more likely to experience nocturnal hypertension, high blood pressure spikes during sleep. That alone can double the risk of a cardiac event overnight. And yet, no one talks about it. I want to hear from you. Do you usually eat dinner late? Or maybe have a bedtime snack out of habit? Drop a comment and tell me how your evening routine looks. You might be surprised how many others do the same. And if you haven't already, now's a good time to subscribe. Because in the next section, we're going to talk about a bedtime habit that might feel like it's helping your sleep, but is actually one of the most dangerous things you can do after 70. Number 2. Taking sleep medication without supervision. Imagine this. You've been tossing and turning for over an hour. You check the clock, 12:47 a.m. Again, you sigh frustrated. The house is silent, your mind is racing, and your eyes refuse to stay shut. So, like many others, you reach for that little bottle in your nightstand drawer. Maybe it's over the counter. Maybe it's something your doctor prescribed years ago. Either way, you pop a pill, hoping for rest. Now imagine doing this 3, 4, 5 times a week. Sounds familiar? For many seniors, sleep medication becomes a crutch. But what feels like a quick fix might actually be digging a deeper hole. Here's why. As we age, our bodies process medication differently. What your liver could break down at 50 takes much longer at 70. That means sleep meds, especially benzodiazepines or even strong antihistamines, can linger in your system, leading to grogginess, confusion, and slowed breathing during the night. And in some cases, especially when mixed with other prescriptions or alcohol, they can cause breathing to stop altogether. A study published in JAMA Internal Medicine found that adults over 65 who regularly used sleep medications had a 4 times higher risk of nighttime falls, memory loss, and even death during sleep. Not because of the medicine itself, but because of how it's misused or overused without close supervision. And here's the kicker. These pills don't even lead to better sleep quality. They may knock you out, but they don't let your brain reach the deep, restorative sleep stages it desperately needs. So ask yourself, do you rely on sleep aids more than you'd like to admit? If you're comfortable sharing, leave a comment below. I promise, there's no shame, only support here. And don't go anywhere, because next, we'll look at a bedtime behavior that millions of seniors do every night, without realizing it's quietly damaging their brain health. You won't want to miss this. Number 3. Watching TV or scrolling on your phone right before sleep. Picture this. You're lying in bed, the lights are off, and the house is quiet. But your face is lit up by a glowing screen. Maybe you're catching up on the evening news, scrolling through family photos, or watching a few YouTube clips just to unwind. It feels harmless, even comforting. But what if I told you this simple habit could be damaging your brain? The average senior in the US spends over 3 hours a day in front of a screen, and many do it right up until bedtime. You might think, I've earned the right to relax however I want. And you have, but not at the cost of your long-term health. When your eyes are exposed to blue light from phones, tablets, or TVs late at night, it suppresses melatonin, the hormone your brain produces to signal it's time to sleep. Without melatonin, your body gets confused. Your brain thinks it's still daytime. As a result, you stay in the lighter stages of sleep longer and spend less time in deep, restorative sleep, the kind your brain needs to flush out waste and store memories. Harvard Medical School researchers have found that exposure to blue light before sleep can delay melatonin production by up to 90 minutes. That's an hour and a half of interrupted sleep rhythm every single night. Over time, that disruption adds up. Studies have linked chronic poor sleep to memory problems, anxiety, and even an increased risk of Alzheimer's. Not because of aging, but because the brain simply isn't getting the deep cleaning it needs while you sleep. Let me ask you, what's the last thing you look at before you close your eyes at night? Is it a screen? Be honest and share in the comments. You're definitely not alone if it is. And if this part has struck a chord with you, hit that like button. It helps us reach more folks who need to hear this. Up next, we'll uncover a surprising bedtime mistake that sounds relaxing, but can quietly increase your risk of stroke as you age. Number 4. Sleeping in a reclined position instead of a bed. Let me take you into a familiar scenario. You finish your evening tea. The living room is quiet. You slowly ease back into your favorite recliner. It cradles your back just right. Your legs are elevated. The TV hums softly in the background. Before you know it, you're asleep. And maybe, just maybe, you decide to stay there the whole night. After all, it's comfortable. It feels safe. Why bother moving to the bedroom? But here's the problem. Night after night of sleeping in a reclined position can be far more dangerous than most seniors realize. When you sleep in a chair, or even in bed but at a semi-upright angle, it puts unnatural pressure on your lower back and compresses your chest. That posture can restrict deep breathing, especially for seniors already dealing with sleep apnea or heart issues. The lungs don't fully expand. The heart works harder. And over time, this added stress increases the risk of a nighttime cardiac event or silent stroke. A recent study from the American Heart Association found that seniors who regularly sleep in reclined positions rather than lying flat in bed have a 60% higher chance of developing irregular nighttime breathing patterns and oxygen deprivation. That's a quiet danger because it doesn't always wake you up, but it can do real damage to your brain and heart over time. I get it. Some folks sleep in their chairs because of back pain or acid reflux. But there are safer ways to manage those issues. Adjustable beds, wedge pillows, simple positioning changes, anything that supports the body while still allowing your lungs and heart to function naturally. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever slept in your recliner overnight? Or do you know someone who does it every night? Let's open up this conversation because it might just save someone's life. And if you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe. The final part of this video is coming up, and it's the most important one. We're going to tie everything together, and I'll leave you with a message every senior deserves to hear. So let's take a moment to breathe and reflect. We've talked about late-night meals, the kind Thomas Miller never thought twice about. We've explored the hidden dangers of sleep aids, the silent damage of screen time before bed, and the all-too-common habit of sleeping in that cozy recliner. And all of it leads us here, to a simple truth. Getting older doesn't mean giving up control. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It means becoming more intentional, more aware, more protective of the time we do have left. Because sleep isn't just about rest. It's when your body heals, when your heart resets, when your brain clears out the fog of the day. And one bad habit, repeated over weeks, months, years, can slowly rob you of that healing. But the good news? You can start changing it tonight. Don't wait for a warning sign. Don't wait for a doctor's visit or a scare that shakes you. Start now. Eat lighter. Power down the screens. Talk to your doctor before touching another sleeping pill. And please, save the recliner for naps, not your full night's sleep. Your future self will thank you. Your loved ones will thank you. Now, I want to hear from you. What bedtime habit surprised you the most? Which one do you think you need to change? Leave a comment. I read every one, and this community learns from each other. And if you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. Share it with someone you care about. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got more coming on how to stay sharp, strong, and safe through your 60s, 70s, and beyond. Because age doesn't define your health. Habits do. Sleep well, stay wise, and I'll see you in the next one.